This is where your vision ends, Robert. It's cluttered, expensive, and quite frankly, it smells of mothballs. The laser pointer in my hand didn't shake, but the red dot on the rendering of the Bozeman Cultural Center suddenly felt like a drop of blood on a shroud. I turned. Chloe, my protégé, the woman I had pulled from a mediocre junior firm and spent 3 years refining, was standing at the head of the boardroom table. She didn't look at me. She looked at the board of directors with a shark's smile. "I've prepared a streamlined alternative," she continued, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. "One that cuts the overhead by 40% and removes the academic heaviness Mr. Thorne insists on." With a flick of her thumb, the screen behind me changed. My blueprints, the result of 3,000 hours of sweat and structural calculations, were replaced by a glass and steel shell that looked like a cheap perfume bottle. It was hollow. It was soulless. It was exactly what the board wanted. "Chloe, we discussed the load-bearing integrity of those spans yesterday," I said, my voice low, vibrating in my chest like a failing engine. "That design won't hold under a Montana winter. It's a death trap, not a landmark." "It's innovation, Bob," Arthur, the senior partner, interrupted. He didn't even look at my drawings. He was leaning forward, captivated by the shiny, hollow pixels. "We're in the business of building the future, not archiving the past. Your classicism is a luxury we can no longer afford." "It's not classicism, Arthur. It's physics," I replied. I could taste the copper of a mounting migraine behind my eyes. "No, it's ego," Chloe snapped, finally locking eyes with me. There was no gratitude there, only the cold hunger of a scavenger. "The firm is moving forward, without the dead weight." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I felt the air leave the room. Arthur stood up, smoothing his silk tie with a practiced, cynical grace. "We've already voted, Robert. The intellectual property for the Cultural Center remains with the firm. Your contract is being liquidated as of this morning. Security has your personal effects in a box at the lobby desk." "You're stealing the signature on my life's work," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "We're saving the project from your boredom, Bob," Arthur said, heading for the door. "It's business, nothing personal." 10 minutes later, I was on the sidewalk. The Montana wind whipped through my coat, carrying the scent of incoming snow and exhaust. I looked down at the cardboard box in my arms, a drafting scale, a chipped mug, and a photograph of the site when it was still just dirt and potential. My hands were cold, but my heart was a block of absolute frozen iron. They hadn't just fired me, they had tried to erase me. I turned my back on the glass tower, the weight of the box shifting against my ribs. They thought they had taken everything. They forgot that I was the one who knew where the foundations were buried, and exactly how much pressure it would take to make them crumble. The key turned in the lock of my penthouse for the last time, with a sound like a bone snapping. I didn't look back at the empty rooms or the ghost of the life I'd spent 30 years building. By noon, the wire transfer for the fire sale price hit my account. By dusk, the skyline of Bozeman was a receding, jagged line in my rearview mirror, quickly swallowed by the shadows of the Gallatin Range. I stopped where the road turned into a memory of gravel and rotted pine needles. The cabin sat at the base of a granite peak, a slumped silhouette of gray cedar and rusted corrugated iron. Beside it, the old sawmill stood like a skeletal beast, its massive circular saw blade choked by decades of ivy and orange scale. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums, far more honest than the sycophantic chatter of the boardroom. A week later, the first heavy snow began to fall. I sat on a crate in the mill, my breath blooming in the frozen air. On the small battery-powered radio, a local news snippet crackled through the static. Chloe Vance, the new face of Thorne and Associates, was seen tonight at the gala for urban innovation. She spoke of breaking the shackles of the past, as groundbreaking begins on the Cultural Center next month. I reached out and clicked the dial. Off. I picked up a wire brush. My hands, once used to gripping fine-tip technical pens, were already mapped with new scars and blackened by grease. I began to scrub the drive shaft of the primary turbine. The screech of metal on metal echoed through the valley, a raw, dissonant scream that felt better than any scream I could have let out myself. My routine became a liturgy of friction. I didn't think about Chloe's smile or Arthur's betrayal. I thought about the tension of the belts. I thought about the structural integrity of the mill's foundation. Every morning, I hauled buckets of icy water from the creek to flush the grit from the gears. My muscles burned, a deep, aching heat that eventually turned into a cold, hard numbness. I was replacing the main drive belt when a delivery truck made the climb 2 weeks later. The driver handed me a thick envelope and a crate of specialized industrial lubricants. "You really fixing this place up, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, looking at the rusted behemoth of the mill. "Seems like a lot of work for a ghost town." "The ghosts don't mind the noise," I said. My voice sounded deeper, eroded by weeks of silence. "Well, you're in the papers." He gestured to the envelope. "The firm you started. Looks like they're making a mess of the foundation work downtown. Soil instability, they say." "I know the soil," I replied, taking the envelope. "It doesn't forgive shortcuts." I watched him drive away. I didn't open the envelope to read about their failures. Instead, I went back into the mill. I gripped the heavy iron lever of the main sluice gate. My knuckles turned white. With a guttural groan of protest, the gate moved. Water from the diverted stream rushed in, hitting the turbine blades with the force of a freight train. The floorboards vibrated. The massive saw blade began to hum, a low, predatory thrum that shook the very marrow of my bones. In the city, they were dancing on sand. Out here, in the freezing dark, I was finally finding the rhythm of the stone. I wasn't just rebuilding a mill. I was calibrating a reckoning. The grease under my fingernails had become a permanent part of my anatomy, a black map of my new reality. I stood on the skeletal remains of the sawmill's mezzanine, looking down at the massive cedar beams I had salvaged from the valley floor. My hands were a mess of cracked skin and half-healed blisters, but when I gripped the heavy iron wrench, my pulse was steady. The city lived on paper. I was learning to live in the earth. By day, I transformed the mill. I didn't use the flashy, unsustainable materials Chloe favored. I used the mountain itself. I anchored the new structural supports directly into the granite shelf, using a tension-based system I'd sketched in a notebook 20 years ago and forgotten in the rush of corporate life. It was architecture as an act of survival. The phone rang, its shrill cry echoing against the corrugated metal roof. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. "Robert? It's Miller from the County Environmental Office. We've got a problem at the Blackfoot embankment. The spring melt is coming early, and the silt levels are skyrocketing. You're the only one who knows the hydrology of this basin." "The soil there has a high clay content, Miller," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "If you try to dam it with concrete, it'll liquefy. You need to terrace it with native stone and willow stakes. Let the water breathe, or it'll take the road with it." "We don't have the budget for a full overhaul," he sighed. "Then you'll pay for a funeral instead of a fix. I'll send you the flowcharts. Don't call me back unless you're ready to dig." I hung up. I wasn't just a hermit. I was becoming the ghost in their machines. I spent my nights staring at the USGS seismic monitors on my laptop. The Bozeman Cultural Center site, my stolen masterpiece, was sitting on a precarious lens of subterranean silt. I knew every inch of that ground. Chloe's streamlined design had stripped away the deep pile foundations I'd engineered. She had traded stability for aesthetics. I pulled up the local weather satellite. A massive atmospheric river was forming over the Pacific, a wall of moisture headed straight for the Gallatin Range. Just a little more weight, I whispered to the empty mill. Just one heavy rain. I turned back to my work, lifting a 100-pound slab of reclaimed slate. My back screamed, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain, but I didn't drop the stone. I set it perfectly into the hearth of my new home. I wasn't building a monument to my ego anymore. I was building a fortress of truth, stone by heavy stone, while the world I left behind prepared to float away on a foundation of lies. The rumble didn't come from the sky. It came from the soles of my boots, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the mountains were finally surrendering their ice. I stood on the bank of the creek, watching the water transform from a crystal ribbon into a churning, opaque sludge of mud and debris. The spring thaw wasn't a gentle awakening this year. It was a violent liquidation. My phone buzzed on a nearby stump, vibrating against the bark with frantic persistence. I didn't pick it up. I knew the rhythm of those calls. They had started at dawn, short, panicked bursts from former colleagues, followed by the heavy, lingering rings from the firm's executive line. I let the creek drown them out. A black SUV with city plates struggled up the muddy track an hour later. Miller, the county inspector, climbed out, his face the color of wet ash. He didn't wait for a greeting. "It's the Cultural Center, Robert," he shouted over the roar of the water. "The west wing shifted 4 inches this morning. The glass facade is popping like light bulbs. They've evacuated the 3-block radius." 4 inches? I adjusted the tension on the sawmill's main pulley, my movements slow and deliberate. "That means the subterranean silt lens has liquefied." I told the board that ground was a sponge. "Chloe Vance is on site with a team of stabilization experts," Miller said, wiping rain from his glasses. "She's trying to claim it's a localized seismic event. But the press found your original geotechnical reports, Rob. The ones she simplified out of the final filing." "It's not a seismic event, Miller. It's physics. You can't negotiate with gravity." I walked to the SUV and looked at his dashboard tablet. The live feed from the city showed my stolen masterpiece, now a twisted cage of steel and shattered vanity. A massive diagonal fracture, wide enough to swallow a man's arm, had ripped through the main atrium. The streamlined drainage system Chloe had touted as innovative was a joke. Water was geysering through the floorboards, turning the $50 million foundation into a soup of gray slurry. In the corner of the frame, I saw her, Chloe. She looked small, her designer coat stained with mud, her hands pressed to her mouth as she watched her career collapse in real time. She wasn't a visionary anymore. She was just a girl who had tried to build a mountain out of cardboard. "The board wants to know if there's a way to shoring it up," Miller whispered. "Arthur is offering a blank check. He's terrified of the litigation." I wiped a streak of grease from my forearm and looked up at the granite peaks. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and inevitable endings. "Tell Arthur I'm busy," I said, turning back toward the mill. "I have a roof of my own to finish. And tell Chloe to get away from the glass. When the main span goes, it won't matter how much the coat cost." I walked back into the hum of my machinery. The trap I hadn't even set had finally snapped shut, triggered by the very earth they thought they could ignore. I felt a strange, cold peace. The mountains were reclaiming the truth, and for the first time in months, the air in my lungs felt perfectly clear. The gravel crunched under the tires of a vehicle that didn't belong in these mountains. I didn't look up from the sharpening stone. The rhythmic, metallic hiss of my chisel against the wet grit was the only sound I wanted to hear. Then the engine cut out, and the silence that rushed back in was stained by the smell of hot brakes and expensive exhaust. I heard her boots first, thin, stylish leather slipping on the damp pine needles. Then came the heavier, frantic stride of Arthur. I didn't turn. I poured a little more water on the stone and continued my work. "Robert, please." Chloe's voice was thin, stripped of its corporate varnish. It vibrated with a tremor I'd never heard in the boardroom. "We've been calling for 2 days. The structural integrity of the West Wing is at 0. The city has issued a permanent stay of execution on the site." I wiped the blade with a rag. The steel was cold and perfect. Finally, I turned. They looked like ghosts against the towering shadows of the Gallatin Range. Chloe's face was drawn, her eyes rimmed with red, her hair matted by the mountain mist. Arthur stood behind her, his silk tie loosened, looking every bit the $50 million he was about to lose in lawsuits. "We're prepared to offer a full reinstatement, Robert." Arthur stepped forward, his hand outstretched as if he were still standing on a Persian rug in the penthouse. "Not just reinstatement, a senior partnership, chief architect. You'll have total creative control over the stabilization and the redesign. Just tell the board you've found a solution. Sign the affidavit that the original design was sound and the failure was a contractor error." I leaned back against the rough cedar post of the porch and picked up my mug. The tea was bitter and hot, the steam curling around my face. I looked past them, watching the last sliver of the sun bleed out behind the granite peaks. "I told you the silt would liquefy," I said. My voice was quiet, a low rumble that seems to come from the ground itself. "You called it academic heaviness. You called it ego." "We were wrong," Chloe whispered. She took a step closer, her hands trembling. "Robert, if you don't help us, the firm is dead. I'll be barred from the AIA. I'll lose everything. Please, for the work, for what we built together." She reached out to touch my arm, but I didn't move. I simply looked at her hand until she pulled it back. There was no anger in me, no heat. Just a vast, cooling indifference. They weren't villains in a play. They were just small, tired people who had tried to cheat the laws of the universe and were surprised when the universe answered. My vision was cluttered and expensive, Chloe. It smelled of mothballs, remember? I took a slow sip of the tea, feeling the warmth settle in my chest. I looked her in the eye, seeing the reflection of the dark woods in her pupils. "Take a deep breath. Can you smell that?" She blinked, confused, her breath hitching in a sob. "It's the scent of damp earth and failing timber," I continued, my voice level and icy. "It's the smell of your career rotting from the bottom up. It smells of mold." I stood up, the chair scraping softly on the floorboards. Arthur began to speak, his voice rising in a desperate, jagged pitch, offering more money, more titles, more lies. I didn't listen. I walked to the heavy oak door of the mill. "Robert!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the mountain air. "You can't just leave it like this. What do we do?" I paused at the threshold, my hand on the iron latch. "Learn to dig," I said. I closed the door. The heavy thud of the bolt falling into place was the final period on a sentence 30 years long. Inside, the mill was warm. The smell of fresh sawdust and old stone filled my lungs, the scent of something honest. I walked over to the drafting table I'd built with my own hands. On it lay the blueprints for the new local infirmary, a structure anchored into the bedrock, designed to last 300 years without a single drop of vanity. I picked up my pencil. The mountain was quiet, the air was clear, and for the first time in my life, the foundation was solid.